Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. And to those of you that are new, welcome. Tonight we have Danielle Macklin, and as always, and she will be talking to us about incorporating all things Google into NUITEQ Snowflake lesson activities.
Thanks, Jack. What we are going to cover today, we are going to be spending our session talking about how to incorporate all of the wonderful things that are available through Google into a Snowflake lesson activity. So I will preface this by saying I built a lesson activity with a theme based off of what I had taught previously in my experience as a middle school social studies teacher. Obviously, there are so many other avenues that you can take with this. Google is so fantastic for every subject. So don't feel that you can only use this for social studies. This was just what I wanted to be able to show in order to incorporate all of those really fantastic components of Google. And I know that so many schools are part of the G Suite for Education, so they have access to all of the platforms available with Google. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen as always. And we're going to first look at how to build in your own Snowflake class by importing your Google Classroom roster. So as I've logged into my Snowflake account, I'm brought to my lesson activities page. We will go and visit this Egypt-themed lesson activity momentarily. This is going to be our lesson activity with all things Google. But before I begin, I want to make sure that I have my Google Classroom ready so that I can send my lesson activities to my students, or so that I can share a lesson activity link with my students on Google Classroom. So I feel that that's a really good starting point. So if you are not familiar with how to create classes in snowflake.live, you would begin by selecting this class dropdown and then choosing Manage Students. From Manage Students, I'm going to see all of the classes I've created, and I have my options to now bring in classes from a variety of sources. I can create my own classes. I can import a CSV file. I can import from ClassLink, but for today, with all things Google, I'm going to import a class from Google Classroom. Once I select import a class from Google Classroom, it is going to provide me with all of my Google Classroom accounts. So I've logged in using the same email address that I have set up with my Google account, so they are synced. And I'm going to import my roster from my brand new NUITEQ Snowflake class. Once I select OK, and you'll see I only have a few students in this class. I only have 3 students in that class. But within that class, I can now see who my students are. Since I am the students in my class, I've already logged in and I have that notification that those students have signed in. I have the ability from my classes where I can send messages to my students. So if Danielle needed a message, I could send her a message, or I could send messages to all of my students. But now I'm ready to move forward with building my lesson activities. So my roster of my 3 students in my class has synced, and I'm all connected with my Google Classroom. So from here, now that I have my class, I'm ready to build that lesson activity. So for this particular lesson activity, I chose to create a cards lesson type. I just wanted to provide enough space to show everything that I wanted to demo. So that's why I selected cards. And I'm going to go into edit mode. So what we're going to cover today with everything Google, we're going to talk about how to incorporate Google Slides, how to incorporate Google Docs, and then we're going to look at Google Arts and Culture, which has so many fantastic resources. We'll also talk a little bit about Google Earth, and then we'll end with a quick overview of Google Jamboard. So lots of different Google pieces today. And if at any point you have questions, please go ahead and ask them in the questions tab. So right now I just have a very basic simple cards activity. I haven't put in any questions yet. I'm just using this really as my vessel to show you how to incorporate all the other Google items. And I would do that through the lesson activity info. So in my lesson activity info, we have our abilities to add our descriptions, to add our YouTube videos, do all of the fun tags here. And then in our web links, since Google is a web-based platform, this is where I can add in my different links. And I've already preloaded a few of them, but I'm going to go through. I'm actually going to take that Google slide out. I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about how to add those links in, and then I'll share with you the links that I've uploaded for this particular lesson activity. So I'm going to start with a Google slide. So with Google Slides, I've built my slideshow presentation for my students. So in my own classroom, I taught a middle school social studies class, and one of the kind of overall themes of that class for my 6th graders were civilizations of the ancient world. So we studied ancient Egypt, we studied Mesopotamia, we studied ancient Greece, and my students loved Egypt. That tended to be their favorite one. So being inspired by my experience with those 6th graders, I wanted to create an activity that's kind of an homage to the things that they enjoyed learning about. So here I've built my Google Slides presentation. And I can send this to my students in a traditional way of copying this lesson link and then pasting that into my web address. But I want to share with everyone another little trick with with Google Slides. So we know that when we share a Google Slide presentation with students, they're going to see these side navigation tabs. And I want this to be something that my students would be able to click through and not have to scroll through the sides. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that, first of all, my share settings are open. So I have my permissions ready. So if I were sharing this with my students, it would be my district account. I'm going to copy that lesson link. And then I'm going to open that link in a new browser. And before I fully open that lesson link, I'm going to select right here where it says Edit. And I'm going to change this permission setting from an edit mode, where typically when you send the original copies to students, they might try to open it and ask like permission in their sharing settings, or they might make changes to their own copy. And we really don't want our students doing that right now. So I'm going to take out that edit and I'm going to replace it with the word present. That's going to take my Google Slides and it's going to put it into presentation mode only. So that means it will open full screen and my students will see it as if I were sharing it on my interactive panel as a full presentation. And then I'm also going to add to the very end of that the ampersand sign, RM equals minimal. And this is going to make sure that my link is presented in a way that is a little easier for students to navigate. So I'm going to copy this link. And I'm now going to add it to my presentation. So I'm going to paste into my Google Slide web link. And then now, just to show you the preview of what my students would view, when I select play, when my students select info, or if I open info, I'm now going to see all of my external links. And I'm going to see with my Google Slides, if my students select that external link. And obviously in my instructions, I would tell my students what to navigate through and the order in which they should complete the lesson activity. But we all know that, you're teachers, you understand that part. So I'm going to share the Google Slides, and this is the view that my students would see. This is also the view that would present if I'm opening it up in the front of class. And now I have my presentation in present mode, And the normal little navigation button that is on the side that would always get in the way when whenever I had text on my slides is out of the way. With this particular slide, I set this up so that my students can only navigate using these little side tabs. So it's almost like an interactive notebook or textbook. So if my students click anywhere on the screen, nothing will happen. They're not going to advance through. They would use these side tabs to bring them to different locations of the slide. And then by selecting the little King Tut, brings them back to the beginning. So we can see there's our information. So it would be the facts that I want my students to read about or learn about with ancient Egypt and contemporary Egypt. So I have that Google slide now shared with my students. The other option that I have with my Google Slides, and this is a feature for all of Google, is the ability to take either a slide or a Google Doc, and instead of sharing it as this web-based presentation, I can share that as a PDF. So by selecting File and Download, I now can open that and download it as a PDF file. So I'm going to download as a PDF. And in our Snowflake software, in the lesson activities, you have the ability to edit and add PDFs to a lesson activity. So I can take that slideshow presentation and I can send it as a slideshow or download and now attach that as a PDF. So by selecting Add PDF, that is going to bring in my recent PDFs, or it should. I think I need to give my computer a second to load. I'll try that once more. So now I have my PDF attached of my Google Slides, and all of the functionality will be the same. So it'll still navigate in the same way where my students would click the tabs in order to navigate through. But now I can set that so my PDF is available at the very start of my lesson activity. So then when my students select play, or if I'm presenting in class and we select play, that slideshow presentation has now been turned into a PDF, and my students can go through the pages of the PDF and learn more about ancient Egypt. They also have the ability to print and download that PDF. So then they can have their own filed copy of it as well. And then moving forward, they would go into the lesson activity. So that's our using Google Slides to incorporate that into a lesson activity. So the two pathways that can be added. It's also possible to add a Google Doc, and Google Docs we're all very familiar with. And with this particular Google Doc, I have it just as a set of Cornell notes. And again, I can choose to share and then change my permission settings so that I might have anyone with the link can view, can comment, can edit. Now with my students, I would want them to be the viewer and they would be responsible for making their own copy. And then obviously depending on the type of Google Doc I was using, I would maybe change this. So if I wanted it a collaborative document, I could change to editor, and then all of my students can work in a collaborative space using a Google Doc. So once I'm set with that, again, it's very simple to just copy the link and then paste that link into my lesson activity. And now that link is going to be available for my students to view in the lesson activity. The next few places I want to share with you on all things Google are Google Arts and Culture and then Google Earth and Jamboard. So I've already added my link. So I'm going to start just by playing from there. So I have my PDF to begin. I'm going to select my info button. You can see again, there's my PDF. If I do need to access it again, there's my Google Slides, my Google Docs, and now we're going on to Google Arts and Culture. So from Google Arts and Culture, I've found an entire unit focused on Egypt. So that was the link I had tagged in this particular lesson. I just shared that link. And now I can see a bunch of contemporary art collections. I can go through different Google stories, learn a little bit more about different parts related to Egypt. I can obviously pick individual ones and have that loaded in. And then I can see there's over 9,000 different items related to Egypt. And as I click on it, it'll tell me a little bit more about a particular piece of it. So this is the Great Pyramid and Sphinx. This was taken in 1858, and a little more info about that particular piece. So this was one I found that was just exclusively about Egypt. If I go to the Google Arts and Culture main page, I can see there's so many really incredible collections and experiences that can be added into any of the lesson activities, because they are all web-based, and it would just be a simple sharing the web link with students. So exploring the galaxy in 360. This was a really fun making music with machine learning. I played with this for probably longer than most adults would. You move these little characters and they sing like a little tune, and you can adjust their volume and their pitch, and it's just really a fun, kind of cheesy little thing to play with. So that's the fun stuff, but there's so much educational stuff in here as well. I was really excited to see there's a color of the pyramids. So they have so many different art varieties, obviously being Google Arts and Culture, that is one. They have tons of different artworks and collections and daily challenges. This is great for geography, so being able to explore different locations. Lots on AR stuff and being able to sync with your phones. And then I also thought it was really cool to see how Google is using a lot with augmented reality. So this is giving you three-dimensional views of different sea creatures. So students would be able to manipulate how this particular thing would look, so they could see the 360 model of that. And kind of the cool thing with that being web-based, they can link with their cell phones. So since Snowflake the Snowflake Live is a web-based platform, it can be accessible on any web-enabled device. So students can use their phones to access the lesson activities and then access all of the web links within the lesson activities. So there's a lot of really fun stuff in Google Arts and Culture. I could definitely spend a lot of time being super nerdy and going through so many different components of it, and figuring out how to incorporate that into my own classroom. And even though it's art, it might not necessarily be, your traditional straightforward art of what we think of like paintings hanging in a museum. There's so much more that's part of that. So that's just the home page. And then if I hit explore, it takes me to even more. So I can see through the different categories, historical events and figures, explore by time and color. So there's quite a bit within Google Arts and Cultures. And again, the beauty of it all being web-based is all of those links. If you find something great to use, you can link those pieces into a Snowflake activity. So that's our Google Arts and Culture. The next part that I'd like to share with you is Google Earth. And Google Earth is a really fantastic feature, not just for teaching those geography concepts and having students be able to explore places throughout the world, but also incorporating different skill sets. So we tend to think Google Earth, I'm only going to use that if I teach social studies or geography or maybe science. But there's so many other avenues you can do with it. Students could work on math skills by calculating the distance of places. They could plan, a road trip across the country and try and use the mileage to calculate how many gallons of gas will it take. So it's a really good kind of way to just see the world on a bigger scale and feel connected to all of these places that they might otherwise not have the opportunity to experience. In my classroom being social studies, I tried to incorporate a lot of showing students the world. I worked in a very small, very rural community, and these are places that these students might not have the opportunity to physically be in or ever visit, but through Google Earth, they have the opportunity to see what it would be like. So for this Google Earth, I just found a few different cities throughout Egypt, and my students would be able to select those locations and explore more of those cities. This also is going to show them a really good view of the Nile River. And when I did teach ancient Egypt with my students, we spoke a lot of how civilization developed along these really important waterways, and how the water is important because it's going to provide for fertile soil, which you need for farming, and you need food to live. And my students being able to make those connections and using Google Earth was a really good model for showing that. And then also being able to see the places within that. So my students can select on the individual locations, and then the little airplane is going to fly them into that particular space. And then now my students can explore even further. So they can zoom in, they can take their little person and drop them somewhere on the street and get a 360 view of what it would look like being in that particular part of Egypt. Or anywhere else in the world, wherever you are using Google Earth as. So it's just a really, really exciting way to bring the world to students. So here I am. Looks like I might be in a little market. You can see in my photosphere. So my students loved when we could explore on Google Earth and see the places that we were studying about, and see what they look like in today's world. So that was our Google Earth. Now for that particular one, I had shared my link for this assignment, if you will. So I built, when the world loaded, I did a quick search Egypt, and then I was able to add and drop my pins into the different areas that I wanted. And then I simply copied that link and added that into my lesson activity. I could also add my students as collaborators on this if I wanted my students to maybe work in a team to research more about a particular city, and then add their own pins to show other students about that. So it's another really just great collaborative space. And lastly, I want to share with everyone Google Jamboard. So Google Jamboard functions sort of like an online whiteboard, where as a teacher you can present either in class for in-person instruction or remotely. And it has pretty similar what we would see on many whiteboard functions, being able to have the pen to physically write on it. We have what are called sticky notes. As you can see, here is a sticky note, bringing in images, shapes, text box, using the little laser to kind of highlight different areas. And then with Jamboards, you can also change the background. So we have some of the default backgrounds for like graphing, for writing. I can also upload an image. So I could do an image search for Egypt. Now I can make that image my frame background. And then with Jamboard, just like all of our Google Docs, I opened my share settings. I changed my permissions, and then I copied that link. And then once I copy that link, my students now have the ability to collaborate on the Jamboard. So my students can edit and add in like these little sticky notes so that they can add their own pieces to our kind of collaborative space. And then I can end that session by downloading the entire Jamboard as a PDF. So it's a way to have almost a collaborative note-taking space and then saving that as a PDF file. And then again, I just copied that link and I added that into my lesson activity into the web link space. So with Google, there's all of the different features in Google, whether it's Slide or Docs or adding a Google form or any piece of Google that you use, you can add that as a web link file, which makes for really easy navigation and organization. So if I'm sending this to my students could access the information button to find all of those web links. I also can choose to share this into the Snowflake community or share it privately or unlisted. And in this case, I'm going to take this lesson activity. We're going to just imagine that it is a completed lesson activity with a good description and good questions that my students might have to answer. And I'm going to save this one just as private. Oh, I have to have a description. I always forget. So I'm going to save this as a private lesson. And then if I upload, I'll then be able to add that into a group, and I can add my students into my Snowflake groups. The other option is as unlisted. This is one of our newer features with being able to share to the Snowflake community. So by sharing unlisted, that means your lesson activity can be used by anyone who has a Snowflake account. So all of those students that I created my Google Classroom with, they could use this lesson activity. But the difference being I cannot search for the lesson activity within the Snowflake community. So if I were searching Egypt or social or history or an age group, this lesson would never appear. It would never be visible to anyone unless I directly share the link with those students. So I'm going to do that for now.
Danielle?
Yes.
We have a question from someone that says, I've noticed these new buttons. What is the difference between keep private and unlisted?
Okay. So keep private means the only way that you would be able to share the lesson activity with another user of Snowflake is if you had them as a member of a group that you are part of. So for example, I'm part of the NUITEQ content team. We have groups where we're sharing lesson activities that we're building, and the only people who can see them are those of us in that group. Versus if I share to the Snowflake community, that means any Snowflake user can do a search and find the lesson activity. And then they can play the lesson activity. They can edit their own copy, so it only edit on their dashboard, or they can send it to their students to complete. But it's visible to any Snowflake user. And then the unlisted option has the lesson activity where it's a little bit of a wider range of who can use it, but I am the one in control of who can find it. So, and I would be able to share that by using the lesson activity web link. So for example, I'll use that as our demo now. So I'm going to share this as unlisted. No one will be able to find it in the Snowflake community. Doesn't matter if you're searching Egypt lesson activity, if you're searching lesson activity made by Danielle Macklin, it's going to be hidden. But that doesn't mean it's not going to be accessible. So I've shared, and then now if I go back to my lesson activities, I still see it in my lesson activities dashboard. But if I select my shared lesson activities, I have so many tabs open, so I do apologize if this is going a little slow. So from my shared lesson activities, if I select more options, I can share with my group, or I can then take that lesson activity info. That's the one I want to use. And by selecting share the link to the lesson activity, I can copy this link and now I can share it with any Snowflake user. So if I'm using this in my Google Classroom, I can copy my link. I can go to my Google Classroom and I can add this lesson activity. We'll just say that this is a material. So we'll just say Egypt lesson. And then I'm going to select add the link. So I've pasted my lesson. And then now my students in that Snowflake account, once this loads, and again, I have so many browsers open. So now there's that lesson activity, and now my students can find and play that lesson activity. They would not be able to find it in the Snowflake community. I'm sharing it directly with those students. This is the option I would choose if I wanted my students to create their own lesson activity and use my information as the model of what to build. So if I'm, and I think that's really the direction that a lot of educators are moving into, is we're trying to move students from consumers of content to creators of content. I stole your buzzword, Jack. And with Snowflake, when students have their own Snowflake account, they have the ability to make their own lesson activities. And that means that I can send them the link to a lesson activity, and then my students can edit their own version of that lesson activity. So for this one, it was those card pieces. I might say, okay, your final task, now that you've navigated all of these parts from Google, our slides, our Google Doc, our arts and culture, your final task is now going to be edit this lesson activity to answer questions or to generate your own questions with answers, teaching your classmates what you've learned about Egypt. And so this is it's another really good way to have students take in that ownership of their learning and to provide them with an avenue for their own choice as well. So you're giving them the template, you're giving them the direction, and then they have the opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge with that. I hope that answered all of the questions. I know that was a very long response from me. So that's how I would use the unlisted option. If I didn't necessarily want my students to just complete this as an assignment, if I wanted them to build with it as well. So that was a lot that we've covered today on all things Google. I'd like to give you some time, let any of that marinate a little bit, and then ask any questions that you may have.
So while we're waiting for anyone, if there are any questions, and I think you're pretty thorough, so I'm not sure there will be.
That was a lot.
But while we're waiting, if anyone has any questions other than tonight and just wants to send an email, my email is jr@nuitec.com. So any questions you have about the software, feel free to send it. In addition, if you have any recommendations for things that you would like us to cover in our webinar series, we would be happy to hear that from you, because we really want to present what is useful to you guys. So if there's any ideas that you have, anything that you think would be interesting or different or that excites you, please email us. We'll be happy to try to incorporate those into our series. So I again, thank everyone for coming. Please feel free to email us. We look forward to hearing from all of you. Even if it's something just to chat, feel free to do that. Have a great evening, and we'll see you in a month for our next webinar. Thank you, Danielle. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.